Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we are going to continue our conversation about operant conditioning. You may recall that when we were last together, we were talking about the different types of operant conditioning. So we talked about positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, and we discussed some different examples of those forms of operant conditioning. Now, there is another element of operant conditioning that we didn't get to last time that we're going to discuss today, and that is what we call schedules of reinforcement. In other words, how often should we be reinforcing or punishing behavior? And so, if we look at schedules of reinforcement, I want you to recognize that kind of the first division is between what we call continuous reinforcement and partial reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement's pretty easy. Recognize that you are reinforcing every single time somebody does an action. So, for example, take the picture on the screen. We've got that pigeon. The pigeon's in a Skinner box. There's this little colored disc in front of it. And so that disc, let's just say, hypothetically speaking, it alternates between being red and being green. Well, perhaps every single time the pigeon pecks at that red disc, it gets food. If it pecks it once, it gets one little food pellet. If it pecks it 1,000 times, it gets 1,000 food pellets. This is what we call continuous reinforcement. Or imagine I have a big giant jar of Tootsie Roll Pops in my room, and every single time you raise your hand, I throw you a Tootsie Roll Pop. Every single time. It's what we call continuous reinforcement. And the advantage to continuous reinforcement is that you can very quickly learn a behavior. If you want a Tootsie Roll Pop, you know exactly what you need to do. All you got to do is raise your hand, and you get one coming at you. The problem is with continuous reinforcement is that when that reward goes away, the behavior could go away, right? If all of a sudden my box or bucket of Tootsie Roll Pops is empty, well, then you might just stop raising your hand. And again, this can happen with punishment too. We punish you every time you do something, right? Every single time you are late to class, I mark you tardy. But if all of a sudden I stop marking you tardy, in the attendance log, you might just stop coming to class, right? And so with continuous reinforcement, you are going to acquire a behavior very quickly, but that same behavior can quickly go away as soon as the consequence goes away. So there's this other kind of schedule that we call partial reinforcement. And the idea behind partial reinforcement is that you are only reinforced occasionally. Maybe it's every 5 times you do something, or maybe it's every 5 minutes that you do something. So let's look at this pigeon, for example. Maybe the pigeon isn't given a pellet of food every time it hits the red disc. Maybe it needs to peck at that red disc 5 times before it gets food. Now, the disadvantage of partial reinforcement is it takes a little bit longer to figure out what you're supposed to do to get rewarded. It takes you a little bit longer to learn a behavior. But the advantage is that behavior usually will last longer. It'll persist. And so there are different types of partial reinforcement, which we're going to talk about in our next slide. But let's think about this kind of real world example. Because in an ideal situation, you would start with continuous reinforcement and then transition or shift into partial reinforcement. When I was potty training my children, well, we started with continuous reinforcement. We got a big old bag of M&Ms, and every single time my son or my daughter went to the bathroom in the toilet, we'd give them an M&M every single time. And they quickly realized that if they wanted to get a little piece of candy, all they had to do was go sit on the toilet and go to the bathroom, and they'd get a piece of candy. And then what we did after a few days was transition from this continuous reinforcement, where they got a reward every single time they did an action, to a partial reinforcement, where we would say, okay, here's the deal. You need to go to the bathroom 3 times in a row. And if you go to the bathroom 3 times in a row, you'll get a M&M. And then we do that for a day. Then we say, okay, you got to go to the bathroom 5 times in a row. And if you do it 5 times in a row, you'll get a piece of candy. And so as we transition into partial reinforcement, the idea is that behavior will stick around and that behavior will linger, and they won't unlearn or become unconditioned to going to the bathroom where they're supposed to. So 2 main types of schedules, continuous and partial. When we look specifically at partial reinforcement, there are 4 different types of partial reinforcement, which brings us to a grand total of 5 schedules. Continuous reinforcement would be 1, and then 4 types of partial reinforcement. What do the different types of partial reinforcement look like? Well, let's take a look at this next slide. Partial reinforcement can be divided in a couple of ways. First of all, we need to ask ourselves, are we going to reward someone based off of an interval or based off of a ratio? An interval is time, how much time has passed. A ratio, on the other hand, is an action, how many times you have actually done something. So let's think of some common jobs that you may have as a teenager. Well, one common job that you may have is working in fast food or working in retail or something like that. And you likely get paid by the hour. And so if you get paid $10 an hour and you want to make $100, don't worry about taxes and things, then you know, okay, I got to work for 10 hours. You know that if I put in the time, I'm going to get paid. It's based off of an interval. So anyone who's getting paid hourly or getting paid on a salary, we would call those interval reinforcement. Whereas some of you, maybe your job isn't based off how much time, it's based off of a behavior. And so maybe it is, I mow lawns, and my neighbor across the street, I mow their lawn every Saturday, and if I mow it, 3 times or 4 times, then they give me $100. They're not going to pay me every single time because they're tired of writing checks or they don't always have cash on them. And so they say, okay, you come mow my lawn 4 times, I'm going to give you $100. You mow it 4 more times, you get another $100. That's based off of a ratio. It's based off of you actually doing something. And it doesn't matter how long it takes you. So the first kind of question you ask yourself, are we reinforcing based off of simply time passing? Or are we reinforcing based off of you doing some behavior? Once we figure that out, then we need to figure out, well, how often? Now, if it's consistent, if it is always the same, we would say it's fixed. If it's random, if it's 3 actions one time and then 20 actions the second time, that's what we call a variable. And then if you put these two kind of components together, the interval or ratio, and then the fixed or variable, then it gives us our 4 schedules, and it kind of creates this matrix, if you will. So think of it this way. An hourly paycheck, you are paid the same amount every single time, is what we call a fixed interval, because it's based off of time and it's always consistent. If you want $100 and you get paid $10 an hour, you got to work 10 hours. If you are still being reinforced off of time, but it's random, we would call that variable interval. It's not a very great way to reinforce someone. You would not want to work for a company where they pay you maybe on Wednesday of this week and then Saturday next week, and then 3 weeks go by without a paycheck, and then you get 3 paychecks in a row. That would be awful. So a variable interval is not a great reinforcement schedule, and the reality is it doesn't exist very much in the natural world. One way to think of it, I've got that picture of the cell phone, is if you think of a text coming in as being rewarding, right? Well, there's nothing you need to do in order for that text to come in. It's going to come in, and then some time will pass, and then it might come in. You might get another text message come in. So a random amount of time has gone by. You haven't had to do anything, and then it happens again. If you're looking for shooting stars, right? Well, there's a shooting star, and then 5 minutes goes by, there's another one. Or 5 days or 5 weeks goes by, and then there's another one. And so it's a random amount of time that you have no impact on. The big thing to remember with interval schedules is that you do not impact when the reinforcement happens. Unlike ratio. With ratio, it's all up to you. If you don't do anything, you won't get reinforced. So let's think about a fixed ratio. For a fixed ratio, you have to actually have an action, and there is a consistent amount of times you have to do something. Every 10 times the pigeon pecks at the little disc, it gets food. Punch cards. Every 10 times you buy a coffee, you get a free coffee. That's a fixed ratio. Every those leaf bags, right? If you're doing some yard work, and your parents say, for every bag of leaves you fill up, I'm going to pay you $1. And so you go in the backyard and you rake leaves all day long, and you fill up 20 bags. You're like, all right, $20. It's a fixed ratio. It's consistent, and it's based off you doing something. Variable ratio, this is where gambling comes in. With variable ratio, you got to do something, but you don't know how many times you have to do that. And so think about a slot machine. Maybe if you pull that lever one time, you're going to win the jackpot. Or maybe if you pull that lever 20 times, you'll win the jackpot. Or maybe you need to pull that lever 2,000 times to win the jackpot. You don't know. And it's addicting because in order to get rewarded, you have to play. And if you stop, man, it could be the very next action that gets rewarded. And so think about this pigeon in the Skinner box, right? Well, if the pigeon is pecking at that disc and he pecks at the disc 5 times and gets some food, he thinks, okay, I need to peck at the disc 5 times. So he pecks it 5 times and nothing happens. And another 5 times and nothing happens. And then he just keeps pecking that disc all day long, and then finally more food comes out. Well, that pigeon will peck that disc all day long because it doesn't know when it's going to get fed. And so that's the idea of a variable ratio. So schedules of partial reinforcement, you can ask yourself 2 questions. Is it based off of time or action? And is it consistent or is it random? If you know the answers to those 2 questions, you can figure out what type of schedule it is. So let's look at some examples. Okay, might be a good idea to pause the video, look at these 8 examples, and see if you can come up with what the answer is. So I'll kind of pause 1 second or 2. All right, so if we look at these, rat gets food every 3rd time it presses a lever. Okay, well, it's based off of the rat actually doing something and it's consistent. That sounds a lot like, and all the answers are going to pop up at once. That sounds like fixed ratio. Getting paid weekly no matter how much work is done. If you're working at Burger King, it doesn't matter if you make 3 cheeseburgers or if you make 3,000 cheeseburgers, you're still getting paid the same amount. That is a fixed interval. It's interval because it's based off of time and it is consistent. Getting paid for every 10 boxes you make, again, it's consistent. You got to make 10 boxes if you want to get paid, but it's based off you doing something. That's fixed ratio. Hitting the jackpot, variable ratio, we talked about that one. Winning the lottery, you play once a day. Don't get confused about these types of questions. If you are playing something once a day, it doesn't guarantee you will get rewarded for it. So you're doing something, you're playing the lottery, that makes it a ratio, but it's still random. And the fact that it's still random means it's variable. So winning the lottery, you play once a day, variable ratio. Checking cell phone, sometimes getting a text. That was the example we gave, variable interval. Buy 8 pizzas, get 1 free, fixed ratio. And a fundraiser averages 1 donation for every 8 houses. Again, these are the ones that sometimes students get tripped up on. They say, oh, okay, 1 out of every 8, that sounds fixed. No, you're averaging 1 out of every 8. It still doesn't guarantee when you are going to get rewarded. It's still random. You got to go knock on the houses, and maybe you'll get 8 in a row. Maybe you'll go to 60 some odd houses and not get a single donation. And so be careful of questions that use things like averages. Those will trip you up. Okay, when we're talking about operant conditioning, let's think about some real world application to operant conditioning. Look at this picture of these kindergarten students sitting around the rug. Well, that teacher in the picture is brilliant. My guess is this is not the very first day of kindergarten because kindergartners are crazy. I've met lots of them. It's likely that that teacher used a process called shaping. The idea behind shaping is you have a target behavior. You have a goal. And in this case, the goal is children sitting quietly, crisscross applesauce with their hands in their lap. Well, chances are she couldn't get those kids to just do that immediately. So through operant conditioning, you reward small behaviors in order to get to the target behavior. That's the idea of shaping. Reward small behaviors, and when those small behaviors are accomplished, you work your way up to the target behavior. So maybe the teacher rewards these children with Tootsie Roll Pops just for standing on the rug. And so for a week, that's what they practice. All right, it's rug time. And once everyone's standing on the rug, they all get Tootsie Roll Pops. And then the next week, okay, here's the deal. You got to be sitting on the rug. So everyone goes and they sit on the rug and they get a lollipop. And the third week, okay, you got to sit along the kind of the outside perimeter of the rug. And then you have to teach kindergartners what the word perimeter means. And then, okay, now we got to sit crisscross applesauce. And you get the picture. You slowly work your way to the target behavior. Token economies. The idea behind a token economy is, I don't know what's rewarding for you. Maybe you hate Tootsie Roll Pops, and so trying to reward you with a Tootsie Roll Pop doesn't work because you don't like them. Well, a token economy is when I reward you with something that has no value at all. I put a sticker on a sticker chart. Who cares? Well, here's the good news. If you get 5 stickers on the sticker chart, you can pick out any prize from my prize cabinet. A token economy is when we give you something that carries no value at all, but you are able to accumulate those and turn them into something that you do value. And so elementary schools that use sticker charts, for example, is a token economy. When I was in elementary school, I went to a place called Donovan, and we got these Donovan doozies for having a clean desk. And at the end of the year, you could turn in your Donovan doozies and you could get cool erasers and slinkies and all those wonderful toys that kids enjoy. That's the idea behind a token economy. And then finally, if I can get my mouse to work here, that's it. I thought, oh, okay, yeah, I had one more slide. I thought I had one more slide. Let me pull this up. I don't know what happened. Finally, let's talk about obsessive-compulsive disorder, which maybe you're thinking, well, that was kind of a wild turn out of left field, but it really isn't, because obsessive-compulsive disorder is this really fascinating component of abnormal psychology that is a perfect example of operant conditioning. We're going to get to it in just a second, but first let's dispel some myths. There are these myths out here about OCD, and that OCD is all about being a perfectionist and having, all of your papers at right angles and you color code everything. That's not really it. The idea behind obsessive compulsive disorder is that it is distinguished by 2 main characteristics. The first one are the obsessions, and those are repetitive thoughts, things that you simply can't get out of your mind. And the second one is what we call compulsions, and those are the repetitive behaviors. People conduct these compulsions in an attempt to get rid of the obsession. Now, if we think about how that works, you do a behavior to get rid of the obsession. That's negative reinforcement. Obsessive compulsive disorder exists because negative reinforcement exists. If you think about what negative reinforcement is when we take away something you don't want and the behavior increases, the behavior strengthens. Well, let's kind of apply this to OCD. Most obsessions in OCD are based around survival. They are about things like getting germs or getting attacked or getting something, having something horrible happen to you or having your house burned down. That is usually what the obsessions are about. And the compulsions are usually an attempt to reduce that stress. So the person who obsesses over germs may compulsively wash their hands. Now, you might be washing your hands a lot these days, but we're talking about washing your hands 400 times in a day. The obsession is, I'm going to get some germ that's going to make me very, very sick. So the compulsion is, I'm going to wash my hands 10 times in a row. And if I do that, if I wash my hands 10 times in a row, I don't have to think about that obsession anymore. It makes that obsession go away. So the behavior is increased, it's reinforced by taking away something you don't want, the obsession of getting germs. Or maybe the person is obsessed that someone's going to break into their house, and that's all they can think about is someone breaking into their home. And so the compulsion is to check and double check and triple check the locks around their home. And they may open a door, close a door, open a door, close a door, do this several times, check the locks. That is their compulsion. That is their behavior in an attempt to get rid of the obsession. I don't know if you've ever experienced this before, but there are times when I have to wake up earlier than I'm used to. So I set my phone on my alarm. That's not correct. I set the alarm on my phone, and then I put my phone down and I'm worried, did I really set it? Did I actually just turn it off? And so I think about it and I can't get it out of my mind. I think, oh, I'm not sure if I actually set my alarm correct. That's my obsession. And so then I compulsively look. I check it. I'm like, okay, I said it correctly. And then even after doing that, I might think, but did I really? And so I check it again. I don't know if you've experienced that before, but the idea is that you're obsessing over this thought, and if you want to get rid of that obsession, you have a compulsion. OCD impacts around 1%, 1 to 1.2% of the population, slightly more common in women than it is in men. As far as when we tend to see this happen, well, someone can develop OCD at any point in their life. There are two time periods where it's most common. Uh, Early, like 10 to 12 years old or so, is a common time for people to experience symptoms of OCD. And then again in late teens, so we're talking 17, 18, 19 years old. But really, it can happen at any point in time. As far as what do we do about it, well, we tend to use a lot of behavioral treatment, things like counter conditioning, and we'll talk more about that in our treatment unit. But that was a lot of information about OCD in a short period of time. And with those schedules of reinforcement, I hope I didn't trip over my words too much and it makes sense to you. That should do it for today. If you have questions about something, shoot me an email, let me know, and best of luck.